All right, so this morning we just had the Siena New York Times poll drop. We did a national one. We're not going to get into that one. We are going to get into the state ones though, because they did both Florida and Texas. Now, the Florida one is kind of confirming what I put on my channel yesterday, that it seems to be more and more unreachable for the Democrats. And I truly think that's the case. The early voting numbers right now do not look favorable for the Democrats, but the turnout is low and there could be a change with the voting method. We might see a lot more Democrats vote early in person, which would revert back to what we saw pre-pandemic. So we'll still see what that is, but the poll numbers don't look good. On the other hand, the Texas poll numbers are really interesting because we now have another poll where Kamala Harris is within the margin of error in Texas. And this is starting to become a trend. But there was one thing that I noticed on this poll that was quite interesting, and it was the withholding of information or withholding of certain questions. Now, today, the New York Times did not release the Senate poll from Texas. And usually, the day that they release the presidential poll, they also release the Senate poll, but they didn't today. And this was both in Florida and in Texas. Now, I still think Florida, the Senate race will kind of look like the presidential race does in Florida. But are we going to, see a surprise in Texas tomorrow? Is it possible that we see a surprise in Texas, that the New York Times is withholding this because it might show a poll closer? Because remember, Allred has always been outperforming Kamala Harris. And if Kamala Harris is within the margin of error in Texas, we might see a poll that has Allred either tie, leading, or extremely close in Texas. So keep an eye out on that because I found that very, very interesting. So let's go ahead, delve into the polls. Let's look at the Florida one first because I think this is the least shocking of them all. Go into the crosstabs and everything. Now, before we get into this, I want to mention two things. The first one is the poll that we're going to do for the 13th congressional district in Florida is probably going to be delayed because, there's a hurricane going right toward the congressional district. And it will be interesting to see how this actually impacts the vote. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I want to mention in regard to this poll is we're going to go over the methodology and all that. But to me, after doing the questions about the polls yesterday, all these pop-up firms, this is a legitimate poll that really does have good methodology, that tries to get the best samples and does good screening. So this is why I look at a poll like this. And we'll look at the crosstabs and see which ones are a little bit iffy, right? So it's not like every poll is great, but it's not fly by night. It actually contacts people, has interviews with them, and that's the most important thing. All right, let's go over to the Florida poll. All right, so if we look at the poll in Florida, we see Donald Trump is up 55-41. And honestly, based on the trends that we're seeing in early voting right now, which is only vote by mail right now, it looks more like Florida could replicate the 2022 result, in which Ron DeSantis won quite heavily, compared to the 2020 result, in which it was 3.36% between Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Now, if we go ahead and break this up into geography, we'll see that Miami-Dade County is very, very close. As I've mentioned in my previous talks about Florida, the Democrats need to get back to that 59 or 60% mark in order to win the state of Florida in Miami-Dade. This poll indicates that everything but that is happening. If the Florida Democrats want to actually win the state again, they need to get Miami-Dade County fixed. Now, Orlando is 55-37. That seems about right. Southeast, which I assume would be Palm Beach and Broward County, that number seems a little bit low to me. Even if they include Martin County and St. Lucie County, that number does seem very, very low to me, to be quite honest. Tampa, 57-38. That number seems quite high for Donald Trump. To me, this indicates that they are maybe including too much of Pasco County in this number, or maybe too much of Manatee. But basically, Pinellas and Hillsborough should be very, very close. And, I think Kamala Harris will win both those counties, but it should be very, very close. And that should be a large number of that geography, but it isn't. And the rest of the state is 60, which to me is a problem with this poll because nowadays, look at the population in Southwest Florida. You should be doing Southwest Florida separately. That, I think, is a big flaw. Now, if we look at the Hispanic vote for Kamala Harris and compare that to what Joe Biden had with the exit poll back in 2020, we see that the Democrats have dropped amongst Hispanic voters from 53% in the exit poll to 47% now, with Donald Trump's numbers staying the same. So that's 19% of the electorate. We could be seeing a shift, but again, we'll have to see what happens with the votes. And then if we look at black voters, and this is a problem that we've seen with all polls, that all of a sudden Donald Trump has this 10% jump in black voters. So there seems to be, and I think it personally, I think it has more to do with black voters who live in more Republican areas, more affluent black households living in richer neighborhoods are ones that are more likely to be sampled in this, and they skew more Republican. So I do think that that is an issue here. There's no way that Donald Trump's going to win 20% of the black vote. It's going to be more like that exit poll, which again makes it a little bit closer for Kamala Harris. Now, here's something I found very interesting. Of those who voted for Biden in 2020, 89% would vote for Kamala Harris, but 8% would vote for Donald Trump. Now, if you look at the Trump voters, it was 98% to 1. So that seems extremely, extremely lopsided. Okay, now we go ahead and look at the age distribution. As we can see, the biggest group for Donald Trump is 30 to 44-year-olds, which is starting to become a larger group for Harris. But we are seeing the 65 and older crowd go for Donald Trump, but only by 4%. So this is a trend we're starting to see nationwide and in the state of Florida. Obviously, that is an important number. All right, so even with these shifts in numbers, the Tampa number looking a little bit too high, the black number for Donald Trump looking much, much higher than it should be, this isn't going to change the overall picture. Donald Trump is still going to win the state. He might win it by a little bit of a closer margin than we see in this poll. But as of right now, if we look at early vote trends, two things are happening. One, we're seeing a lot less people vote by mail, which just means, again, people might be reverting back to in-person voting. But two, even with those vote by mail numbers, which the requests are basically the same as we've seen in the last two cycles as far as the distribution, not too far off, it does seem like we're looking more toward a 2022 result in Florida, where Ron DeSantis just clean clock, compared to a very close 3.3% result for Donald Trump over Joe Biden in 2020. It does seem like we're going more down that 2022 route. Still need some more data. Some big counties like Broward, Orange, and others that are big Democratic counties haven't brought in any votes yet, or very, very few votes. Orange County finally got some yesterday. We still need to get a few more votes. Okay, now let's go ahead and go over to the Texas poll. So before we get into the actual horse race numbers, these are the first numbers that you usually always see in the poll. They ask, how certain are you to vote? And almost certain to vote was a tab that I found quite interesting because it showed Austin at 68%, where you had the rest of the state at 59%, Houston at 60%, and Dallas-Fort Worth at 50%. Now, that Dallas-Fort Worth number, and I'm just going to put this here, I don't know if that means the Dallas-Fort Worth area, which would include a number of other counties like Denton County, for example, or if that number is purely Dallas and Tarrant County. I don't know. So there's not much clarification on that. But the fact that Austin, the most liberal place in the whole entire state, is at 68% enthusiasm is a good sign for the Democrats. All right, so here we got the Texas overall poll. So we can see it was done and out in the field the 29th of September to October 4th. It had 617 likely voters, so they actually contacted more. They had mixed cell phones and landlines. It doesn't seem like they have the 97% cell phone number like they do in others, so it might be a little bit more of a mix. And we have a margin of error of plus or minus 4.8%. And as we can see in this poll, Kamala Harris is down 6%, which is within that 4.8 margin of error. Remember, upper and lower bounds, that puts her within the margin of error. All right, so I went ahead and put the white vote up here, and I just want to show you there isn't a huge amount of change. We do see a shift a little bit more to the Democrats, but it's kind of essentially the number that we should expect in the election. Now, if this trend is starting to help the Democrats, then that's a good thing. So now if we look at Hispanic voters, we see that there's a big drop for the Democrats. So the exit poll had them at 58% back in 2020, but the New York Times poll right now has them at 49%. The Donald Trump number has not moved, but the Democratic number has gone down significantly So that means that we don't know where that extra vote is going to go. Now, if we look at the geographical distribution, we see, no surprise, Kamala Harris is winning in Austin, 68%, 27%. Dallas-Fort Worth, we see that 56 to 36%, which tells me that they're probably including the suburbs as well. If we look at Houston, we see 49 to 45% for Donald Trump, which again means they're including the suburbs as well, because if we're looking just at Harris County, we would have Kamala Harris in the lead. San Antonio at 52% to 41%. Again, that's including all the areas in and around San Antonio. And then the rest of the state, obviously, very, very, very Republican, and not an insignificant amount of the vote, by the way, 72% for Donald Trump. So now let's go ahead and look at the age distribution. Here you can see it's quite different compared to what we saw in Florida. The 18 to 29-year-olds are pretty close compared to what we're seeing in other polls, but that 30 to 44, remember back in that Florida poll, how that was totally lopsided? This number here is about what we're seeing at the national level. So this looks good for the Democrats. That 45 to 64 number, especially in a Republican state like Texas or Republican areas, has been totally out of whack for Democrats, and that makes sense. And as you can see, the 65 and older number is the exact same as it was in the Florida poll, 46 to 50. So the Texas poll looks a lot better. It does seem like there's some possibilities. And as I mentioned before, they're withholding a lot of questions right now. I'm really wondering, I really want to see what that Senate poll is, because when they've done the other polls in other states that had the Michigan poll, when they did Michigan a little bit ago, they went ahead and included the Senate race and released it on the same day as the presidential poll. So the fact that the New York Times is actually holding off on this and saying, we don't have these questions available for publication quite yet, tells me there might be a surprise in that Texas Senate seat. Now, I can be totally wrong. That's just pure speculation. But, when we're looking at Texas, let's be honest, the most important race in Texas is the Senate race. If the Democrats win that Senate race, Democrats keep control of the Senate, right? So that is the most important race that we have. Okay, I wanted to go ahead and look at this poll. Thank you all very much. Make sure to like the video, go ahead and comment down below, and subscribe. Become a member if you want to help this channel financially. I will see you in the next video. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.